I flew to Miami to surprise my wife. What I heard outside room 847 broke me. I had pictured so many small, ordinary moments on that trip. The look on her face when I knocked, the embarrassed laugh when she realized I'd flown down on a whim between semesters, dinner at a quiet place she liked, a walk along the water, roses on the hotel bed. I teach history to high school sophomores. I spend my days talking about choices people made when everything felt uncertain, about small acts that led to large consequences. None of that prepared me for a hallway in a hotel, midweek, at midnight. I booked the flight the night before. It cost more than I like to spend on a whim, $300, $400, but that wasn't the point. Glinda worked as a senior account manager at Meridian. She was at a conference that week. She'd been exhausted for months, buried in decks and travel, always apologizing for bringing her work home. We'd been married 12 years. There had been moments, the ordinary irritations, the drift of two busy lives, but the foundation felt steady. She liked orchids, her coffee black, and she could recite obscure Civil War facts in the middle of a grocery aisle just to make me smile. I arrived late. Miami at night is a different smell, salt and exhaust and something bright from the bars. The hotel lobby was quiet. The clerk, her name tag read Maria, was friendly enough. I asked for directions to Glinda's conference floor, trying to act ordinary, a husband playing the part of the innocent tourist. She gave me a map and a floor number. I took the elevator, the doors whispering closed behind me, and stepped into a carpeted hallway that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. Room 847 was at the far end. The light under the door cast a strip across the carpet. I thought, she'll open, she'll laugh, we'll both be embarrassed. I imagined her opening the door with one hand holding the conference folder, the other reaching to pull the door wider once she saw me. Then I heard it. Laughter at first, the kind that sounds easy and private. And then the sound shifted, lighter, then a tone that broke into something else. Not words, not a conversation. The sound carried through thick hotel wood and foam tatting and my own imagining until it landed in my frame of reference like a stone. I don't want to use ugly words. I will only say this. The sounds were intimate and unmistakable, and they were not something two colleagues would make while rehearsing slides. The roses I'd held in my hand, long-stemmed, still wrapped in tissue, fell from my grip. They hit the carpet with a soft slap, petals scattering. For a second I thought I might explode, knock down the door, drag her out, demand an answer, demand an explanation. That was the animal response. Everything in me wanted to tear open that wood and force the truth into the light. Instead, I did what I had always done when a classroom escalated. I paused. I listened.
I learned to use delay not as cowardice, but as control. As a history teacher, I'd taught students about sieges and strategy, about commanders who took the long view and won by patience. I told myself then, in that hallway, that impulse would be my enemy. I'd seen men make scenes in hotel corridors and then spend the rest of their lives regretting what they'd done in 2 minutes of rage. So I backed away. I did not storm room 847. I let the door remain shut. I pressed my back against the opposite wall and breathed through an ocean of disbelief. My hands still smelled faintly of rose thorns. My heart hammered like a bell. But the part of me that gathered evidence, the part that grades papers and pays attention to small telling details, took over. I had to know more, and I had to know it in a way that could speak louder than any angry confrontation. I walked down to the front desk. Maria remembered me. She remembered the roses. I asked casually who was in room 847. Her eyes flicked to a ledger, then to her screen, then back at me. She was careful with what she said, as hotel clerks often are, but she confirmed a name on the reservation, David Price. She said the card used to pay for the room was noted on their system as a company billing. That small fact sat in my chest like a second, deeper surprise. Back in the room I'd rented, the one with a view of a blinking neon sign and a thermostat that hummed in the night, I sat on the bed and tried to keep my hands from shaking. I texted Glinda, short and innocuous. Made it, didn't want to bother you late, see you in the morning. The message was a lie by omission, but not a lie about my presence. Otherwise, my pulse might have betrayed me. I didn't want to close that door on whatever she was doing, because closing it would only erase the possibility of evidence. I photographed the hallway, the door, the placard with the room number. I took a picture of the elevator buttons with the 8th floor light on. I saved a photo of the receipt the front desk handed me when I asked for a copy. Hotel name, room number, times. Anything that would map the moments. I folded the wilted roses into my coat, petals between fingers, a keepsake that felt grotesque and precious at once. What followed for me was mechanical more than anything else. Shock was the raw start, but then I moved into a mode of concentration that felt like survival. Collect, document, refrain from accusation until I had something to present that could not be shrugged off as a jealous fantasy. I went home the following morning before Glinda woke. I drove with the roses on the passenger seat, their stems bent, their petals browning. I rinsed my hands and sat at our kitchen table with the photos open on my phone and a stack of receipts on the counter. I had the receipt from the hotel. I had the text I'd sent Glinda.
I had Maria's confirmation, not a sworn statement, but a hospitality worker's recollection, which later became part of the record. I had nothing like a smoking gun yet, but I had more than enough to ask into what had happened. Those first 24 hours alternated between fury and a peculiar, exhausted calm. I let myself go to the clinic the next day and get tested, because when your life breaks in one dazing moment, you try to close as many practical questions as you can. I won't dwell on that part. It's private in the way the rest of this was private and intrusive all at once. I'll only say, I did the responsible thing. I also started looking. Not at her phone. I knew better than to do anything that might cross legal lines. I started with what was mine, our accounts, the credit card statements that came through to our home email, the calendar on which she sometimes left brief notes. The pattern, when it started to come into focus, did not fit one night of reckless behavior. There were hotel charges on nights that had been described as conferences and client meetings. Some were billed directly, morning after morning, to Meridian. Others showed up as late check-ins paid with cards that, on paper, were tied to a corporate account. I remember bending over the kitchen island in the early light, the phone in one hand, a printout in the other, and feeling both very small and very determined. If this was a mistake, it was a mistake with fingerprints. If it was intentional, then it was part of a pattern that reached beyond our bedroom. The next logical step was to get help. I called James. James had been a roommate in college and the one friend I could always tell the truth to without either of us making it theatrical. He ran a private investigation firm now. People who hire PI services usually imagine smoky rooms and clandestine tales. In my experience, and in James's practice, it was mostly paperwork, patient phone calls, and piecing together mundane records until a pattern revealed itself. He listened, and then he drove down to meet me in my living room. "Don't do anything dumb," he said, in that blunt way he had. He'd watched me navigate both personal crises and classroom blow-ups, and his tone was equal parts friend and professional. "Just tell me what you have." I handed him the photos, the receipt, the note of the reservation, and my hotel room keycard stub, a small, innocuous rectangle that, together with the other details, mapped the night. He took the evidence carefully, like a man handling artifacts. That manner suited him. He treated facts like fragile things. James's first steps were deliberate and lawful. He checked the hotel records, confirmed the name, and followed the billing trail. He told me early that his work would uncover messages and receipts and booking patterns, material that would be useful whether I chose to confront Glenda directly or pursue legal recourse.
He also said something I hadn't been prepared for. You need a lawyer either way. You're entering a space where corporate protections and non-disclosure instruments can muddy the water. That word, non-disclosure, landed like another cold stone. I'd heard of NDAs in the abstract, in the news, places where companies tried to contain stories that could break them. The idea that my marriage, my pain, might collide with corporate mechanisms intended to silence victims felt grotesque and larger than both of us. So I called Rachel. Rachel had built a reputation in our town as a divorce attorney who didn't perform melodrama. She was direct. We can file now. We can file everything. But if this touches an employer, there are federal avenues and there are privacy considerations. You have to be careful about how you proceed. She explained in plain language what the immediate options were. Protective orders were one thing. A preserve of evidence and careful documentation was another. Bringing in the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission would be appropriate if there were signs of workplace harassment. She didn't promise outcomes. She set expectations. Cases like this are messy, emotionally and legally, and they require patience. I remember telling her, in a voice I barely recognized as my own, that my goal wasn't to punish for the sake of punishing. I want accountability, I said. I want other people protected. That phrasing came out more measured than my feelings, but it was true. When I looked at the hotel receipt, when I saw company billing and late-night bookings linked to a senior executive's name, it stopped being only about my marriage. It began to look like a pattern that could rack up more victims if left in the dark. James, Rachel, and I met over the next week. We sat in my kitchen and then at a coffee shop and then at a small conference room where Rachel could close the blinds. James explained what his initial canvas had turned up. Multiple hotel charges on nights that coincided with late events, names that matched attendees at client dinners, overlaps between the senior executive's travel schedule and other women's conference itineraries.
He said he could pull texts and messages, but he was careful about words. He said the messages were available through the channels his firm used, and I later learned that phrase would be repeated like a talisman by professionals who could not, in good conscience, reveal technical methods. All of this James framed as evidence collection rather than storytelling. That helped me. It turned my humiliation into something with shape and motion. It made me less of a wronged husband and more of a person compiling facts that either corroborated a suspicion or explained it away. At home, I made a little shrine of items I could not yet speak about. The wilted roses, a printout of the hotel receipt, the copy of the text I'd sent Glinda. I sat there some nights and let the grief in.
It isn't a single note. Grief comes as small things. A song on the radio, a coffee cup she would never use again, a calendar event that used to mean anxiety about grading, now meaning absence. I let myself feel those things. I also let myself step back into planning mode when the immediate emotion threatened to consume me. I began to assemble the timeline. Teaching has a habit of structuring my thinking. I create maps and timelines for lessons, and I applied the same method here. Friday, conference check-in, room 847. Saturday, client dinner at the Ritz, late-night billing to Meridian's corporate account. Monday morning, a performance review that had been rescheduled. The scatter of charges lined up like coordinates on a map. When patterns repeat, explanations narrow. Rachel filed paperwork to preserve communications. She told me stories about how easily things could be obscured if you didn't move quickly. Calendars edited, receipts lost, human memories reframed. That reinforced the need for restraint and for methodical work. We were not interested in spectacle. The spectacle would serve the story. It would not make the case. We also talked about risk. Rachel talked about the possibility that Meridian would respond in various ways: deny, obfuscate, conduct an internal review, or even try to contain the story with settlements and confidentiality agreements. She cautioned about NDAs, that they sometimes functioned as a method to silence and sometimes as a protection for vulnerable employees, and that their presence did not negate wrongdoing, only complicated public accountability. She said plainly, no one should sign anything that removes their ability to speak unless the terms are fair and they understand the implications. I took that as instruction and armor. By the time the first week had bled into the second, James had found other women who were, at minimum, willing to talk about late-night bookings and uncomfortable moments. Names began to populate a list that once had just had two, mine and Glenda's. There was Jennifer, who had worked at Meridian for a few years and who mentioned being summoned to meetings that took place off-site and after hours. Christine, who spoke about a chokehold of offers that turned into transfers and quiet exits. Their accounts were not all the same story, but the contours matched in troubling ways: an older, powerful man with access to company budgets and the ability to make or unmake careers. Those conversations, James told me, were delicate. Many of the women had signed something, a hush agreement, that made them reluctant to speak publicly. Others were wary of tearing open old wounds, but they also wanted someone to know the pattern. I felt both infinitesimally guilty and oddly responsible.
Guilty because my private life had turned these people into collateral, their names now attached to the same story that was smashing my sense of normalcy. And responsible because once you saw a pattern that could harm others, you could not unsee it. At night, I reread their messages as James forwarded them. Not the messages themselves in all cases. Some things remained legally sensitive, but summaries, paraphrases that conveyed a rhythm. Late dinners, quick phone calls, bookings billed to company accounts, mentions of discretion, offers of career advancement in exchange for availability that dipped into the personal. The manpower of a corporation had been, according to the bits I could see, an enabling infrastructure, budgets to cover rooms, HR processes that shrugged, seniority that insulated. I remember one afternoon sitting at my kitchen table with a list of dates and names and feeling it shrink and grow at the same time. The more I had, the more responsibility I felt to do something that mattered beyond my own bruised heart. I had to decide whether to let this be one story among many whispered around office water coolers, or to try to make it mean something that would protect others. The decision felt less like revenge than like stewardship. I wanted to protect future employees from being reduced to stories in a corridor. I wanted to give Jennifer and Christine and anyone else a chance to stop pretending their silence was a solution. I wanted to ensure that what I did afterward would make it harder for the pattern to repeat. There was also a private angle I could not dismiss: the financial and domestic logistics of separating from someone who had been both a partner and a codependent presence for over a decade. Rachel helped me think through immediate practicalities: safe handling of assets, writing down what I knew,
making sure any legal filings didn't inadvertently reveal witnesses before they were prepared to speak. She told me something necessary and uncomfortable. You can be right and still lose in court if you don't prepare properly. So we prepared. James cataloged evidence. Rachel began drafting motions and drafting language to request preservation of records. I kept a journal, a clinical, dated record of events, because sometimes the mind, assaulted by betrayal, tries to rewrite things into more coherent narratives. A dated log puts the facts below the turn of emotion. One evening, late, I called Patricia Price. This was not easy. Patricia was David's wife. It felt like stepping into another marriage's private room without an invitation. But there are times when truth requires a ripple. I told myself that she deserved to know what a pattern might be doing to her family, that she had a right to hear it from someone inside the ripple rather than from a stranger online.
I rehearsed the words, imagined indignation and shock and anger, and then spoke plainly into the phone. That I had reason to believe her husband had been involved in intimate encounters that were connected to his work, and that I had begun collecting evidence that suggested a pattern. I offered her a choice: stay silent or choose to be informed. She did not hang up. She listened. She said she wanted to know more. Whether she later chose to engage publicly or privately was her decision. The fact that she listened was a small, clarifying moment for me. It confirmed that this was not isolated anguish, but an event that, if addressed correctly, might lead to accountability. As we moved into that second and third week, I found myself doing something I had not expected. My grief hardened into a sense of purpose. I still relived that hallway late at night, the sound leaking under the door like an accusation. I still felt the sting of petals on my palm. But alongside the hurt, I carried a folder of receipts, emails, and notes, a dossier that felt like armor and burden. I told myself I was not pursuing scapegoats. I was not trying to publish pain for sport. The word accountability had a moral center for me. It was about preventing harm. I did not want to become a man who sought retribution for the sake of spectacle. I wanted systems to answer for the way they enabled misuse of power. I wanted protection for quiet employees who might otherwise be told to sign away their stories. Walking that line was not straightforward. I had moments of shame, of humiliation, of imagining she'd denied everything and we'd be left only with noise. I had nights I could not sleep, sitting with a cup of coffee gone cold, thinking about how many small, ordinary moments had changed irrevocably. But I also had James and Rachel, and a list that was gathering weight. We reached a decision point. We would not blow everything open in a single viral moment. We also would not sit on this and hope it disappeared. We would document, preserve, and then coordinate disclosures that protected witnesses and maximize the chance that someone with institutional power, someone who could initiate an impartial review, would be compelled to act. There was a practical reason for restraint too. Advancing prematurely could expose witnesses, damage legal claims, and allow a company to close ranks and slow-walk any review. I'd seen institutions do that in history books and in parent-teacher meetings and municipal hearings. Patience was not cowardice. It was the difference between a momentary cathartic scream and a structural change that reduced risk for others. I will be honest, choosing strategy over spectacle felt cold at times. I wanted, sometimes, to stand at that hotel door and demand answers. But strategy meant I had to rehearse restraint like a muscle.
It meant compiling a list of dates, cross-referencing charges, making sure that the women who might decide to speak had a lawyer or support if they needed it. It required discipline I had not known I possessed. I paused here to say something simple. If this is the moment the story hooked you, and if you want more investigations like this, the careful, slow work of assembling truth, subscribe. There are more stories like mine. That single ask felt strange in the middle of my own unraveling, but the practice was practical. Accountability, in the end, requires witnesses, people who will watch for patterns, people who will pay attention to the small accumulations that scream louder together than they do alone. After the call, after the tiny pause for the subscribe ask, we resumed. James had started to pull together a network of corroborating witnesses and documentation. He had located booking confirmations, cross-referenced them against hotel receipts, and mapped them to David Price's known travel schedule. Rachel had begun the legal architecture for filing preservations and drafting letters to Meridian's HR and legal department demanding that records be saved. I want to be careful here about what I claim as fact and what was still alleged. At this point in the story, I could see a pattern emerging, repeated late-night hotel bookings that coincided with events where David Price had influence, reports from several women describing uncomfortable propositions, and accounting entries that suggested the company, or company budgets, had sometimes been used to defray the cost of those nights. Those are the building blocks of a case, but they are not in themselves a verdict. What they are is a map that points to a larger question. When a powerful person has the ability to reward or punish, what protections exist for the vulnerable? I remember a late afternoon in the second week when James came by with a thin envelope and a thicker look. He placed before me a list, names, dates, hotel bill numbers, and a folder of paraphrased statements from women who were in various ways ready to speak about the pattern. Some wanted anonymity and options. Some wanted to be part of something that might change the company's behavior. They were not a chorus saying the exact same thing, but their stories overlapped in places that mattered. That overlap made what I had experienced less solitary and more systemic. It transformed a private betrayal into a public concern. It made me want to keep moving, not for my hurt alone, but for the safety of people whose names might otherwise be swept under confidentiality. And yet there were personal stakes I could not ignore. Glenda and I had a life built on years of compromise, the small economies of marriage where love and resentment lived side by side. There would be assets to divide, a house to consider, a life to untangle.
Rachel handled those messy particulars with the same steady language she used when describing legal processes. She told me about options, about temporary orders, about ways to secure finances while the facts were being gathered. She didn't promise that the process would be quick or clean. She only promised she would be direct and thorough. There were evenings then where I sat with that promise like a small lighthouse. I would go for a run, cut across the neighborhood, and feel the rhythm of my feet against pavement as a metronome to steady my mind. I took to painting small canvases in the afternoons, something I hadn't done in years, and found that color could be a kind of meditation. I called my mother. I told a close friend the barest outlines. I learned to sleep in small increments. The story refused easy closure. Even as evidence accumulated, there remained the question of how a large employer would respond and what leverage senior executives wielded behind closed doors. Rachel warned about common corporate responses, internal investigations that are slow and biased, offers of settlements wrapped in confidentiality, and the risk that alleged victims might be pressured to accept terms that limited their ability to speak. That was when the moral argument and the legal strategy started to converge in my head. If Meridian was going to respond by trying to minimize exposure, our option had to include outreach that kept protection for vulnerable witnesses at the center. So we planned. Not theatrically, we didn't stage ambushes or call press for a dramatic hallway confrontation, but deliberately, a set of timed disclosures, coordinated legal filings, and offers for witnesses to have counsel before speaking. We considered contacting an investigative reporter, a trained journalist who could vet facts and present them in a way that demanded institutional response. There was a sting of fear there too. Once you engage the press, the private life becomes by necessity less private. Those practical anxieties were real, but so was the conviction that silence protected predators more than it protected victims. When patterns repeat, there are always people who will say they knew or suspected, and then do nothing. That had been the thing that haunted me most, not the betrayal itself, but the thought that others might be hurt because no one gathered the fragments into a coherent, defensible whole. By the end of those first weeks, the list of players had grown. James, the private investigator, who could assemble messages and receipts without crossing legal boundaries. Rachel, the lawyer, who would craft a legal strategy that preserved witnesses and protected me. Patricia Price, who had chosen to listen when I reached out to tell her what I had found. And a handful of women who were, grudgingly and bravely, willing to allow their experiences to be added to the record. We were still, at that point, a small coalition.
We had not yet decided whether exposure would come through a formal EEOC filing, a press story, or a combination of both. We had not yet pressed the company to act. We had not yet served any papers. There was a sense of poised energy in the room when we met, like the air before a storm, charged and expectant. In the quiet that followed one of those meetings, when I was alone in my car outside the courthouse, I thought back to the hallway at the hotel. The sound had not changed its meaning for me. It was still a fissure in the life I thought I knew. But the fissure had, painfully and strangely, provided a lens. Through it, I could see that my pain was neither unique nor intended to be contained. The work ahead would require discipline and steadiness. We had reached a moment where the next step would determine the shape of everything that followed. We could file immediately and let the legal system take its course. We could contact a journalist and let public scrutiny demand answers.
Or we could attempt to negotiate in private, risking an arrangement that might protect us financially, but would keep a dangerous pattern hidden. That was where we were when the sun set on that third week, the future not yet decided, but the record beginning to feel robust enough to stand on. I felt like a man with his back to a map, pointing to the places that mattered, trying to make sure no one else walked into the same corridor unknowingly. We agreed on a plan that felt surgical rather than theatrical: preserve, coordinate, and then compel institutions to answer. There was no grand speech, no dramatic reveal in a hotel corridor. There were emails lodged with lawyers, complaints filed with agencies, and a reporter who treated what I'd brought to her desk like a puzzle to be verified, not a scandal to be sensationalized. Krista Price arrived at my kitchen table with a notebook and a demeanor I'd seen before in people who'd been around enough stories to understand how to tell them honestly. She didn't perform shock or pry for drama. She asked careful questions, the kind that nudged facts into place: dates, receipts, witnesses. I laid out what James had found: the hotel bills, the billing trails tied to Meridian accounts, paraphrased statements from women willing to speak under counsel, and the one small, undeniable detail that had started all of this for me: the night outside room 847. When I showed Krista the receipts and the photos, she did something that surprised me. She did not glance at them and look away. She read them. She looked at me and said, with the kind of steadiness I'd come to rely on from Rachel and James, "We have to be precise. We have to make sure we don't expose people who don't want to be exposed. But there's a pattern here that matters." That phrase, pattern, became the hinge of everything that followed. It turned my private rupture into a public question. We devised the sequence with the careful logic of a lesson plan.
Rachel prepared preservation letters to Meridian's HR and legal offices demanding records be saved. James continued to collect corroboration through channels he described as professional and lawful, language I later learned was a way investigators shield technical methods from public instruction without implying wrongdoing. Those materials were not for spectacle, they were for the record. Krista prepared inquiries for Meridian, sent us a list of questions she would pose, and told us she would not run anything until we agreed on timing. Timing mattered for concrete reasons. If a company lawyer could move quickly, edit calendars, reorder expense records, pressure employees who might otherwise speak, the story would become harder to document. If we rushed, however, we risked exposing witnesses to unwanted attention or undermining legal claims. Rachel's voice cut through both anxieties. We must protect witnesses, preserve evidence, and coordinate with the reporter so that when material comes out, it does so with legal context and support for those involved. It was painstaking, discouraging work. There was nothing cinematic about it. It resembled a long series of small, careful stitches rather than a single bold slash. Patricia Price's decision to listen was more consequential than I had imagined. She did not immediately step into public view. She first chose to process, and then, in a private meeting months later, to confront her husband privately before deciding how she would proceed publicly. The conversation she and I had on the phone was awkward and humane in a way that no script could manufacture. She thanked me for calling her. She said she wanted to know the facts rather than hearsay. She said she had questions she needed answered and wanted time. Later, when David's leave was announced and the investigation public, she filed for divorce. Her involvement complicated our moral calculus. It made the story less about two people and more about relationships that intersected with power and privilege. The press timeline unfolded like a carefully choreographed sequence. James and Rachel built the legal scaffolding, while Krista verified facts and reached out to other potential sources. Jennifer and Christine, two Meridian employees who had initially responded to James cautiously, both fearful of rupturing their professional lives, decided, with counsel, to file formal complaints with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They each signed statements and gave Krista interviews under protected parameters. Some spoke on the record, and others asked for their names to be withheld in the early pieces to protect their careers while the investigation proceeded. On the day the story went public, I sat with my hands wrapped around a mug that had been Glenda's favorite in the mornings. The reporting was not a sensational front-page frenzy.
Instead, it was a thorough piece that laid out documents, receipts, testimonies, and Meridian's own internal calendar entries. Krista had done her job: meticulous, precise, undeniably fair. The article described alleged patterns of conduct involving a senior executive, presented corroborated evidence, and included Meridian's statement that it had initiated an internal review and would not comment further while that review was ongoing. Then the dominoes started to move. Meridian announced it would place David Price on administrative leave pending investigation. Within a few weeks, that administrative leave became termination. I remember the swirl of emails and the small, sharp relief I felt when the news confirmed what our records had suggested. Alongside that personnel action came other filings: Jennifer's EEOC complaint, the launch of a class action inquiry by a law firm representing several former employees, and internal HR memos promising policy reviews and external audits. The company issued a press release about strengthening training and ensuring safe channels for reporting.
That release, while corporate in tone, acknowledged the public scrutiny and promised structural response. I want to be precise about what happened and what didn't. Nothing I or anyone else did in that period involved criminal prosecution. The actions that mattered were employment consequences, civil filings, and public accountability, the kinds of outcomes that can change a workplace culture, if sustained. Meridian's external auditors recommended policy changes and regular reviews. I was told that certain practices, clearer reporting channels, independent investigators for claims involving executives, and the removal of direct managerial oversight where allegations were made, were to be implemented. Whether those steps will fully change behavior is something I still watch. But for people like Jennifer and Christine, they were more than words. They were a recognition that the system had failed them in some instances, and a commitment, however imperfect, to do better. Glenda's trajectory after our evidence became public was painful to watch. She was removed from the promotion she had been in line for. HR reassigned her temporarily while it assessed her role. That was a bitter twist. A woman who had been the private center of my life now found some of her professional aspirations delayed as fallout rolled through the company. I'm not excusing that outcome. It felt unjust to me, but it was the reality of a complicated situation where personal and corporate lines blurred. After conversations with Rachel and long, raw nights of negotiation, Glenda and I came to terms about separation. She left to begin again somewhere she could have space to breathe without the shadow of a public workplace entanglement. I moved to keep the house, a pragmatic arrangement that Rachel negotiated with a firmness that left me admiring her resolve and grateful for her pragmatism.
The settlement we reached with Glenda allowed us both the measure of dignity in an otherwise public unspooling. I will not give numbers here. Those are private and unnecessary in a public telling. What matters is that the settlement included provisions that permitted me to speak about the pattern I'd uncovered and declined to mute the voices of others. Rachel advised me not to sign anything that would prevent me from supporting those who might come forward in the future. I followed that counsel. When Meridian offered certain confidentiality terms in parallel settlement negotiations with others, it was a tightrope. Some employees accepted offers that included non-disclosure as part of the package. Others refused, or negotiated terms that allowed them to speak under agreed conditions. What I refused to accept personally, and what I argued for legally, was the sort of blanket silence that had the potential to protect a system at the expense of people. David Price's termination was public. His professional reputation eroded quickly. Patricia's divorce filing also became a public matter when she chose to pursue it. I do not recount these outcomes as triumphs. They were the results of evidence, legal filings, and institutional responses. My aim in sharing them is not to relish a downfall, but to show that everyday mechanisms, receipts, emails, flight logs, contemporaneous notes, can outlast denials and force organizations to answer. What felt like reckoning to me felt to others like justice. To some, it felt like ruin. That complexity is important. Killing someone's job is not the same as healing the damage that was done. For me, the point was never to finish someone, but to make a workplace safer for the next person. During the height of the public response, I learned fast about the costs of bearing witness. I received messages that varied from compassion to vitriol. There were late-night calls from old friends whose sympathies were immediate and fierce. There were strangers who messaged anger at the idea that their knees should be jerked by public exposure. Some colleagues at school approached with tentative kindness, others circled with curiosity. My students, for the most part, were mercifully kind. The ones who knew began to ask fewer questions and offer more quiet support. Teaching continued to be a refuge, a place where the measured routine of lesson plans and exams let me breathe without thinking about depositions and press cycles. Not everyone agreed with our approach. There were op-eds and social media posts that argued we had turned a personal failing into a public shaming. Those critiques were difficult to digest, especially on nights when I still heard in my memory the muffled sounds under a hotel door. But Rachel reminded me that exposing patterns that harm others is not the same as seeking humiliation for its own sake. James reminded me that accountability is not revenge if it's directed at changing behavior and protecting others.
Those refrains sustained me when the noise increased. The legal landscape was messy and deliberate. Jennifer's EEOC filing yielded a formal investigation that later informed Meridian's own internal steps. The class action law firm filed suit on behalf of several current and former employees. Through discovery, further documentation came to light that underlined the trends we'd already suspected. Discovery is a blunt instrument. It forced internal reports and emails into public records and allowed lawyers on both sides to marshal arguments. Meridian's defense framed the company as instituting reforms and not uniformly complicit. The plaintiff's side framed the company as having tolerated patterns through inaction or willful ignorance. I watched these legal maneuvers with the detachment of someone watching a procedural drama, because at that point my role was documentation and testimony rather than a lead litigator. Rachel handled the filings and negotiations with a steady hand, reminding me that our objective was not theatrical victory, but structural protection. The negotiations that led to David's termination and subsequent settlements were long and often gutting. There were days when I thought the wheels would never turn. There were moments when I feared we'd be buried in legal minutia. But slowly, the tangible shifts began to appear. Meridian announced policy changes formalized by external consultants, clearer reporting pathways that detached complainants from direct managerial oversight, mandatory annual training led by outside experts, and commitments to independent investigations in cases involving senior executives. These were not miraculous fix-alls. They were, however, the kind of bureaucratic scaffolding that could, if enforced, change how claims were handled. After the flurry of press and filing subsided, the quieter work of repair began. Glenda and I met once, at my suggestion, to talk about what had happened between us without lawyers or cameras present. The conversation was not a reconciliation. It was instead an attempt at honesty in a way we had not practiced for years. She apologized for choices she had made. I acknowledged the ways I had been distant at times, how we had let the small neglects accumulate. We both cried. We both left with a gentler kind of finality. I remember, after that night, going for a run until the fatigue of my legs eroded the rawness in my chest, and then painting for hours, letting color and brushstroke inhabit the part of me that grief had emptied. Months became a new measure. I taught through a semester I had thought might be impossible. My students gave me the kind of small, human rewards that make a teacher stay in the classroom. A note about how a lecture changed a perspective, a former student who came back to tell me they'd joined a civic group because of something I'd said. Those details did not reverse what we had lost, but they made the days livable.
I also spoke, carefully and with counsel, to advocacy groups who were interested in how corporate structures can facilitate abuse of power. I shared my story as a case study in how evidence accumulates and how institutions often rely on confidentiality to smooth over complicated internal failures. My role was never to be the loudest voice. It was to be a witness who could help others think about prevention, policy, and protection. Occasionally, Jennifer and Christine reached out with updates: a payment received, an administrative change at Meridian, a private text thanking me for my part in ensuring their complaints were seen. Nothing grand, but the sort of quotidian reassurance that what we'd done had consequences beyond my personal heartbreak. One message stands out in particular. It was a simple text from Jennifer on a weekday afternoon, months after the news cycle had moved on. "Thank you," it said, plain and small. I never thought I'd be able to say that line. Reading those two words, I felt a grief that was easing into something else, responsibility turning toward repair. The text wasn't a vindication of my marriage or a cure for the nights I'd lie awake replaying the hallway. It was, rather, an affirmation that the decision to document and to involve institutional checks had created space for someone else to be heard. There were costs. The stray commentators were unkind. The small community gossip that sometimes follows public moments stung in private ways. Friends lost their willingness to get involved in certain conversations. Family asked questions that felt invasive. But there were also gifts: a renewed respect from some colleagues, the deepening of friendships with people who stayed close and offered steady care, and a new sense of ethical purpose that grew out of the belief that what we do with knowledge matters as much as our pain. As the years slid forward, Meridian kept a public record of steps it had taken: training modules, the appointment of an independent ombudsperson, an anonymous hotline managed by an external firm, and periodic audits. I still attended school board meetings and parent-teacher nights. I still graded essays that digested history's messy patterns. I still painted small canvases and ran the same routes at dusk that I had before any of this happened. The difference was that my life, once internally compartmentalized into marriage and career, had been reconfigured by public obligation: to testify, to support, to resist the neat complacency that protects institutions at the expense of people. The final legal resolutions were a mixture of private settlements and public corporate action. Meridian agreed to certain remediation measures. David Price's employment ended. Glenda took steps for rebuilding her professional life away from Meridian. Patricia's divorce became part of our collective finality, another relationship that unraveled under the weight of what had been revealed.
There were no cinematic confessions in hallways, no grand courtroom declarations about moral failure. What transpired was the slow arithmetic of documentation and consequence: receipts, dates, depositions, corporate memos, and negotiated agreements that reshaped people's lives. In quieter moments, I still find my hand drifting to the pocket where I once kept the wilted petals from those roses. They are long gone now, composted or simply discarded, but the habit of reaching towards small tokens remained. Grief, I learned, does not announce itself only in big gestures. It lives in the way you avoid the radio station that plays a song you both liked, in a coffee cup set aside for one, or in the hush of a house after someone leaves. Healing was not a single moment. It was a sequence of small re-engagements, paintbrushes in the afternoon, the steady routine of a classroom, a text from a woman who said she felt safe enough to keep working in the company she loved. One of the lessons that sustained me was the difference between spectacle and accountability. If I had stormed room 847, if I had given in to an impulsive desire to humiliate in the hallway, the story would have been shorter and messier. It might have felt momentarily cathartic, but it would have left the larger pattern intact. Instead, I chose method because I believed it would do more lasting good. That choice did not make me less hurt. It made me, I hope, more useful. Evidence doesn't shout. It accumulates. When it accumulates in the right hands, institutions are forced to answer. I do not pretend to have been a hero in any stern biblical sense. I am a man who made a terrible discovery and then tried to use patience, counsel, and the tools available to translate personal pain into structural accountability. That translation is imperfect. It costs people in different ways. It doesn't guarantee perfect justice, but it does create avenues for change, and it allows people who might otherwise be silenced to decide how and when to speak. Months after the press cycle ebbed and the lawsuits found their procedural rhythms, I received a message from someone I had never met who said simply, "Because of you, I reported something that had been happening to me for years." That is a heavy, solemn thing to carry, and also a consolation. The story that began for me in a hallway in Miami rippled farther than I could have forecast. People got angry, others found courage. Institutions were forced to look inward. Some things changed, some did not. The work of making workplaces safer is ongoing and never finished. There were also small victories that felt private and profound. I kept the house. I painted a large canvas I hung in the front room, an abstract of blues and iron gray strokes that to me looks like both storm and calm. I started dating, cautiously, the way you test a new recipe after burning a pan, with respect and humility.
I returned to some parts of my life with a new insistence on clarity and communication. When someone asked me recently how I'd learned to be patient, I thought of the corridor outside room 847 and the small, stubborn practices that had kept me from reducing everything to a single act of anger. If there is a final lesson in this, it is that accountability can be patient, that restraint does not equal weakness, and that the choice to document rather than to humiliate can protect people we do not yet know. I still think of the sound that broke me in Miami, that visceral, private evidence of betrayal. But now I also think of the slow work that followed, the preservation letters, Rachel's steady voice, James' tireless collection of facts, Krista's careful reporting, the women who came forward, Patricia's painful decision to divorce, Meridian's grudging reforms. Those things add up into a kind of justice that is not theatrical but structural. When I walk past the door of room 847 in my memory, it is no longer just an object of pain. It is a place where a choice was needed, and where, in the end, I chose a path that tried to keep other people from being hurt. I could have chosen spectacle. I chose strategy. Strategy is harder and longer. It requires patience, legal counsel, and the stamina to hold witness without turning it into revenge. It does not always result in perfect outcomes. It does, however, give the harmed a chance to be heard and to be protected. If this mattered to you, if this story of choice over impulse and accountability over spectacle resonated, please like and subscribe, and tell us in the comments what you would have done in my place.